Is there anybody here who wasn't here last week who needs? Okay.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks so much.
No problem. And I hope people brought tanakun. So Mrs. Ennis is not here today. She's with the mock trial group. So she asked me to once again thank Suzanne and David Prince for sponsoring the series in memory of your father? Father Robert Freund, correct? Okay. I worked on that to make sure I remember that. It takes me about a month to really process all my students' names. Like faces I'm good with, but names, so anyway. So thank you very much. Okay, so just to kind of give a brief recap, what I'm doing over the course of these 6 weeks. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, I made more copies, so if people weren't here last week, they can avail.
Or people were here and can't find them?
That's acceptable too.
I found it.
What?
I found it.
That's acceptable. Not finding things is, I always say in my house, things don't get lost, they just get buried. Unfortunately, they can get buried for a long time, even more than one Pesach to the next.
And a receipt.
So just to kind of again give a sense of what I'm doing here is to take psychological theory, particularly the theory of family systems, which looks at, rather than looking at people in a vacuum, people as individuals, which is what early psychology did. It's looking at people in systems, and that each of us responds to others based on not only who we are in and of ourselves, but who we are in relation to our roles, the people who came before us, the people who are coming after us, and all of this comes to bear on our relationships. So what we did last week was we looked at, so to speak, what was considered the ideal. We're looking at the spousal relationships right now. Depending on how many, if we can get through all three of the avot this week, we can already move into the siblings next week. I tend to overshoot, so I'd rather do things qualitatively rather than just zip through. So we looked at kind of what the ideal relationship was that Hashem had intended for humans, for spouses, which was a partnership of two people who were physical and who were physical/spiritual equals, in that they were both created at the same instant, both created Tselem Elokim, both charged with Pru Uravu Umelu Ha'aretz V'Kivshuha. Then you have the second telling of the creation of the spousal relationship. Do you need a source sheet? Want a source sheet?
Yes, please.
Come join.
Thank you.
No problem. Here, there are more here. Okay, you're going to need a Tanakh also to kind of follow. So that the second telling, however you want to conceive that, and we talked about it through the lens of Rav Soloveitchik, which is that an alternate version is where you have one individual. In this case, the individual in the text was the male individual. That individual has a sense of socio-emotional loneliness, of like, I need someone to communicate with. This is, I think, falls in fairly neatly into Maslow's needs structure of the idea that part of feeling actualized, I feel like I'm in the 1960s again, part of feeling actualized as a human being, part of feeling like a complete human being is having someone to reflect off of and with, and this is what Hashem says, Lo tov hayot ha'adam levado, it is not complete. Adam is not done. Humans are not done unless they have a partner, and that partner is the Ezer Kenegdo, is the kind of the opposite. It's like looking in the mirror and recognizing that this is very, very same, yet different. And all my English teachers, that is like, that expression is, all my English teacher friends, that's the bane of their existence when a student writes, these are similar yet different. But that's really the essence of humanity, is that we are all similar, yet we are different. And the question is like, when that similarity to difference ratio is balanced, then you have a true Ezer Kenegdo. That dissolves in Perek Gimel. There's the one human being does something wrong, leads the other human being to do something wrong. The other human being abdicates his choice on the one hand. On the other hand, is a victim of trust, and then the blame game begins. It's just always so fascinating to me that in the first fight is about whose fault it is, which is quite archetypal. And then what's equally interesting is that both Adam and Chava, both Ish and Isha, are punished for their actions. It's not that one is blamed and one is vindicated, one gets off easier than the other. They're both held accountable for their actions. So even in their punishment, we see that male and female are equally accountable, just like back in Perek Aleph they were equal in their creation, which is, again, typically the Christian view of the Genesis story is, the story of the fall from grace, and is the story of ultimately the inequality of male and female, and not only that, but is effectively a substantiation for the idea that men are superior to women. If you read the text, that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, when the pasuk says, when it says, Hashem says to Chava, "V'hu yimshal bach utshukatech tiyeh elab," means not necessarily that he will physically rule you, no more than we can physically rule animals. What it means is that he will be the, so to speak, the rule maker, but, and this is the second part of the pasuk, you will be desiring of fulfilling his wishes. It's not just that he's going to be making the rules, it's that women's emotional makeup is such that we feel needing approval from the other. And I think this goes, one of you mentioned this last week, that I think it was you, that the need, kind of the emotional makeup of women is and females is fundamentally different. And that's why I said, to some degree that's post hoc, rather than the way it was originally supposed to be set up, where men and women need each other equally. A result of Chava's behavior, as Hashem is saying, is that females in a way need emotional validation and support, and that men's sense of, or the male sense of validation comes from economic success. And that's a consequence rather than a setup to begin with. Okay? All right, so that's kind of where we left off last week. What I want to do now is to move into the relationships between the Avot and the Imahot, because we can see these are basically three models of the marriage relationship, and in the case of Yitzchak and Yaakov, their models of marriage to a certain extent are reactions to what they saw in their own parents' houses. We don't know very much about the relationship between Terach and his wife. As a matter of fact, we don't even know who Terach's wife was. But where I want to start is in Perek Yud Bet. So for those of you who have Tanachim, and if not, you can share with somebody who does. And I want to go actually really to the beginning of the Avot, which I think is Bereshit Perek Yud Bet, if I'm not mistaken. Make sure that I have the Ish. I think my pages got mixed up. That's a test. That's not going to help me. I'm going to grab one of these. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you have the right list. It seems that we're missing stuff. No, we're not missing stuff. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to start. With Bereshit Yud Bet. We did Dalet. Bereshit Yud Bet. We are missing stuff. What do you know? Okay, my apologies. This is what happens. Okay, it looks like it got cut off. All right, let's forget the piece of paper. And let's go to Breshit Yud. Actually, I take that back. Let's go to the end of Yud Aleph, the end of Parsha Noach, which is really where we first meet Avram and his family. I promise that for next week I'll have stickies so that I'm not. My problem is also that I don't memorize well. So it's not like I can rattle. My students all think that if you're a Tanakh teacher, like by definition, you know the whole Tanakh by heart. I keep on telling them that that is far from the case and that memorizing is not my forte, so I understand how long it takes. Okay, so here we are. We're in Perek Yud Aleph. We're in chapter 11, okay? And we are, let's say, for the purpose of the argument, we're in Pasuk Kaf Vav, okay, verse 26. All right, and it talks about Vayi Terach Shivim Shana, and Terach was 7 years old. Vayivaled et Avram, et Nahor, et Haran. Okay, so we don't hear about who Terach's wife is, which is interesting. Again, we know who Adam's wife is. We know who Noach's wife isn't named, but at least she's mentioned. You would think that we would have a sense of who Avram's mother is. We don't. Okay, so Terach gives birth, and he has 3 children: Avram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran gave birth to Lot, and then we know that Haran died in Bavel, right, in Ur Kasdim, and then where we're at now is in verse 29, Pasuk Kaftet, Vayikach Avraham v'Nachor lahem nashim. And this is the classic language that they took wives, and just by the way, take has 2 connotations. Actually, take that back. Take has 3 connotations. Take can either mean with force, take can mean with money, but take could also mean persuading. So don't assume that just because it says vayikach, that he took, that this was necessarily like a forcible thing. We tend to think of marriage in Judaism as this being non-consensual. We know that this is actually quite the opposite, and when we look at Yitzchak and Rivka, we're going to see that that's actually halachic, that it cannot be a forced arranged marriage. It has to be a consensual marriage. It's also an economic relationship, which, again, sounds really utilitarian, but it in the sense that it's economic, in the sense that men and women both have economic rights in a marriage. This is something that was set up from the get-go. And this wasn't unique to Judaism. This was already embedded in Hammurabi's code, that men and women that women actually did have some economic rights. Not many, but a few. Okay, so that they took wives, and Avram's wife was Sarai, and Nahor's wife was Milcah. Okay, significant that their names are mentioned. And Milcah was the daughter of Haran, so Nahor married his niece, and Haran was the father of Milcah and the father of Yiscah, and we generally accept that there are no irrelevant characters in Tanakh, and the Gemara says that Yiscah and Sarah are the same person. So Avram and Nahor both married their nieces. And then it says, and Sarai was barren, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, this common theme of barrenness. And Terach takes his family, and he leaves Ur Kasdim, and he goes to Haran, which is in Syria. And then it says, that they went from Ur Kasdim and they went to Haran, and they stayed there. They moved in. Okay, so now we move along. Now we're in Lech Lecha. Vayomer Hashem el Avram. So now Hashem reappears on the scene. He's been absent since the Mabul. And he says to him, Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'moladcha me'beit avicha, classic, get up, go. Right? And then, and I will bless you, etc., 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 etc. Okay, now we're in Pasuk Gimel. Vayelach Avram ka'asher diber elav Hashem. Vayelach ito Lot. And Avram and Lot went with him. Ito means willingly. Okay, the Avram was 75, and when they left Haran. Okay, Vayikach Avram et Sarai ishto. And here we have this Vayikach, and he took, and this is one of the sources for the fact that to take is not necessarily by force, because Sarai and Lot are both mentioned in the same breath. He took Sarai and he took Lot, and we know from the previous pasuk that Lot went with him and went willingly with him. It wasn't that he didn't have a choice in the matter. Okay, he took and all of their possessions. Ve'et hanefesh asher rachashu, ve'et hanefesh asher asu b'charan. Okay, and there's a very famous Rashi here, because the whole previous, and Rashi jumps in because the rest of the pasuk is all only about Abraham, right? Abraham did this, and Abraham did that, and Abraham did this, and if you look at it, the pasuk is all in singular, and now all of a sudden, it says ve'et hanefesh asher asu, that they made in Haran. And what the Gemara here, and Rashi quotes it, jumps in, famous Gemara, Abraham megayer et hanashim, ve'Sarai megayer et hanashim. That what is being set up here is that this arrangement, this relationship that Abraham and Sarah had in a marriage was a partnership. It was a partnership of roles, of responsibilities. It was very much, they were like missionaries, but they were a missionary couple. It wasn't just that, like the model, the JLIC couples that they now have on that the OU is putting on campuses. You have two members. It's not like a rabbi and the Rebbitzin being the rabbi's wife. It's the rabbi and the Rebbitzin being the female rabbi. Okay, without calling,
Wow.
without calling it Maharat or Rabat or whatever. These terms are like really dumb, and in my humble opinion. But I also think it's dumb for men who have rabbinic knowledge to be called rabbis, but that's a whole different story. Go back to the Gemara in Sanhedrin and you see what smicha really means. And it's like mind-boggling what these humans had to know and did know, and we don't. In any case, political statements aside, you basically have Rabbi Avraham and Rabbanit Sarah. I think Rabbanit is probably the best way to describe them. And you have this relationship that's established. And if we now go through the rest of the Avraham and Sarah relationship, we see that they are equal partners in this relationship. So that, for example, right, when they leave a few psukim later, right? Vayira ba'aretz, vayelech Avram, Vayered Avram Mitzrayma, lagur sham, ki kaved ha'aretz, and when they got there, right? And he says to Sarai Ishto, which is also interesting. The Malbi makes a deal out of this, is that she's referred to as Ishto in the sense again that she is his equal, she's his partner. And this is why he has to make a request of her. And he says, Hinei na yadati, behold, I now know, ki eshet yifat Torah, that you are, yifat mareh, I'm sorry, that you are beautiful. The Mefarshim talk about why is it all of a sudden Abraham at 75 and Sarah at 66, all of a sudden he's noticing that she's beautiful. And again, the Mefarshim talk about here that her physical attractiveness wasn't the key element of their relationship. It wasn't that he didn't find her attractive. I mean, he's been living with her for umpteen years at this point, but it wasn't what drew them and held them together. What drew them and held them together was more a meeting of the minds rather than just what you would call, the typical either utilitarian or physical sexual kind of relationship. And he makes a request of her. And he says, I need you to lie for me. It's a really weird request in and of itself. I need you to lie for me. Why? Because the Egyptians are going to see you. And if they think that you're married, they will have no qualms about killing me and abducting and raping you. If they think that you are my sister, then they'll be nice to me because they'll know that I'm the one who's going to give permission for you to get abducted and raped.
Yay.
Yay, right, yay, super duper. And what's fascinating is she agrees. Like, put yourselves in, sorry, Mr. Gelb, you're the odd man out here for a second. Women in the room, put yourselves in this position, right? You go to, I don't know, Islamabad, for lack of a better example, and your husband, for whatever reason, has to go to Islamabad, and for whatever reason, you have to go with him. And he says, I want you to wear a burqa so we can go out in public. Now let's stop for a second and think about what we might say to our spouses at that moment. And at best, I think we would say, that's okay, thanks, I think I'll stay in the hotel today. But this idea of having to do something that clearly goes against both her grain and his grain, and she has nothing to gain by this, by the way. She's going to somehow get abducted, aka married, taken married, no matter what. The only difference is, and it's the Malbim who points this out, is that if she is his wife, he's dead. And so he can't do anything to help her. And this is the thing where he says, and they'll be nice to me for your sake. He's not saying they'll be nice to me so I'll have a first-class suite while, you're down there doing what you don't want to be doing. The Malbim explains is, what it means is that I'll be alive and better a live dog than a dead lion. At least if I'm alive, I have a way of possibly protecting you. If I'm dead, I don't. Either way, she's in a really unhappy position. She goes along with it.
But it's also a matter of they don't go there because they want to.
Correct.
I mean, starvation is on the other side of the coin.
Right, except that if you look at the Ramban, for example, they shouldn't have gone.
Right.
I mean, the whole question that they went is morally questionable. Also, they didn't have to go to Egypt necessarily. They could have gone very often. The next choice was Eretz Plishtim. They also could have gone back to Haran.
Didn't the same thing happen in Plishtim?
Yes, but we know that the morality of the Plishtim was actually different, which is why Avimelech, and we're going to get to that,
Yeah.
Avimelech gets so
Her
irritated.
fate was in jeopardy either way. though.
Correct. Her fate was in jeopardy either way. But again, to think of yourself as being silent, even to the point where you get taken into the house of Paro and you are now facing becoming part of Paro's harem. And we know historically what happens when a woman goes into a harem. It's like going into the gulag. You don't leave. You don't. You're done. You don't get out of the harem because it would be a incredible humiliation to the king for one of these harem women to leave. No other man can marry you, right? Because once you've been with the king, like think of Megillat Esther, once we've been with the king, and this was universal. These were the rules in Persia, in Turkey, in China. Like, the harem woman did not have her own life out of it. One of the theories of how the idea of a geisha came to be in Japan is that this was an alternative. Rather than be a harem wife to the emperor, you were kind of an external harem
Freelancer.
wife, right? You were the escort. But at least you, so to speak, had your own life. And this was a way for women to have some control over their lives. It's an interesting historical perspective. But so Sarah does. She does keep her mouth shut. This does have a relatively happy ending, and good. So the next place where we see Sarah's role is in the story with Hagar, which again is why is there tension between Sarah and Hagar? So here we go. Let's go back. Let's go down to, I think it's Perek to Dalet, if I'm not mistaken. Or is it? I think is it Yudalad where he brings home Hagar? It's after Lot leaves. And again, I'm sorry that I don't have these. For some reason, these sources didn't make it onto the page.
Just a question,
Yes.
if Sarah is the daughter of Haran,
Correct.
then she and Lot are brother and sister?
That's correct. Which is why when Abram says to her, "Say you're my sister," it's actually not a complete lie. This is one of the Mefarshim points this out, and I'm blanking on who it is that especially if we look in Tanakh and how the language of familial relationships is very fluid, that brother can mean extended family member, that the whole question with who was Yitro, right, or who was, for that, actually it's who was Reuel. Was Reuel the same person as Yitro? Because Reuel is referred to as Tzipporah's father, but it's possible that he was also her grandfather. So the whole language of family clan relationships was very fluid. So for her to say that she was his sister, well, she was his niece.
So why didn't he just say that I'm your uncle?
Because then he doesn't have the control over her marriageability.
I would think that he would, if her father was not there.
But they didn't know that necessarily.
Our brother
Then
would
Lot
and
has
Uncle
more of
Right,
the
that, exactly.
control.
Then Lo would have the first voice. In other words, in the ancient Middle East, kind of the hierarchy was father first, in absence of father, brother, until there's a husband, and then the husband trumps father and brother. But once there is no more husband, that's also why, for example, why Yehuda said to Tamar, "Go back to your father's household." Like she was never. But in the Avram Lot Sarah scenario, Lot would have trumped Abraham. But Avram was clearly older than Lot, so the older brother would then trump the younger brother. So it was kind of a thought through plan. Kind of flawed, but thought through it in any case. Okay, so let's go to the Avram Sarai Hagar situation. By the way, just as a what?
Tetzai.
Thank you. Tetzai.
It's on your sheet.
It is on my sheet?
Yeah.
Good. Then it's just my eyes aren't working that well. Thank you. Okay, so in the situation with Avram, Sarai, and Hagar, whose idea was it?
Sarah.
Right. It's Sarah's idea. It's not Avram's idea. Just as an aside, for the record, there is not a single case of polygamy in the entire Tanakh that works out happily. Okay? So while the Tanakh allows for polygamy, it's certainly not encouraged. And we see this
But
here.
often it's the woman's idea,
Right. Right.
so.
Whether it's her idea or whether it's not her. In other words, in the case of Hagar, it's her idea. In the case of Rachel and Leah, which we'll get to, it's certainly not their idea. But this case definitely seems to be her idea. And in other cases, it's not quite clear, like with Elkanah and Hannah and Penina, and then with David and his wives, it seems pretty much at that point, that it's in the man's hands. But it's certainly discouraged. And for those of you who are interested in the world of She'elot and Shuvot, there is fascinating She'elot and Shuvot amongst the Sfaradi Geonim, where men literally had to ask for halachic permission to marry more than one woman, and then had to prove that they had the economic and psychological means to support more than one household. So it wasn't just a given, I want to marry another, I want to marry a sister wife, so to speak, like the Mormons. You go and do it. This was a long process, and these were letters that went back and forth, and a Beit Din, and checking on character and on economics, and you had to submit, like an IRS form, and so it's really a very fascinating kind of process. But Sarah says to Avram, is okay, look, I'm an akara, I don't have children. You need to take a concubine so that ulai ibane mimena. And Avram is not so keen on the idea. It seems that he's already kind of aware here that bringing another woman into a household is not a good idea. And clearly it pans out that it's not a good idea. By the time it's not a good idea, there's a child involved. We'll talk about that in another point, that, once there's a child involved, things get much, much, much more sticky. So this does not work out. And again, the reason that it doesn't work out is that Hagar doesn't play by her set of rules. Okay? And then when it's not working out so well, she goes back to Avram, and this is much, much later. This is after Yitzhak is born, obviously, and I mean, she kicks her out twice. She kicks her out. She wants to kick her out, and she comes back, and then after Yitzhak is born, he's like, she's gone. She's out of here. And it wasn't so much having to do with her that Abraham objected. It was having to do with his son Yishmael. And at that point, God has to himself intervene and says something very important. Kol asher tomai la'elech asar shma b'kulam. That, again, we walk around with this idea in Judaism of male dominance, of it's, always the man's way, and it's a patriarchal society, and there are definitely aspects in law and in societal structure where it is patriarchal. But if we go back and we look at the models that we have here, it's not so clear-cut. And more often than not, it's the wife's voice and the wife's decisions, particularly when it comes to children, that hold sway. Okay, you kind of gotta keep that in mind, and to the point where Hashem is telling not only Avram, but Hashem is telling future readers. And again, this is an insanely edited document, and we also tend to forget that's what I tell my students. Like, if you count all of the words that Avraham Avinu is recorded as saying, whether to Sarah, whether to Paro, whether to Avimelech, whether to God, he probably says less words in his 100 years that we know of his existence than we say in 100 minutes. So, if a conversation gets into this document, it is of incredibly high significance, which is why, at least I pay, and when I teach, we pay very, very close attention to every word that is, in fact, documented. So, Avram and Sarah, before we get to the Sarah and Hagar situation, Avram and Sarah go down to Eretz Plishtim. Same thing happens again. This is, I will admit, front and center why he does the same thing twice, gets himself into the same situation twice. I don't know. But what I do take away from the situation is that, again, Sarah goes along with his request. She keeps her mouth shut. Things work out better. The second time, Avimelech doesn't even get to the point of potentially compromising Sarah. Hashem comes to Avimelech, says, don't touch her, she's married. Avimelech gets very indignant, which is a really interesting story in and of itself, and goes to Avram like, why did you put me in this compromising position, pun intended. And Avram said, well, because I judged you, and which is, and that's really where the animosity between, Abraham and Palashet really begins. And then we have the whole story later with the wells and closing up the wells, and there's not really very good blood between the two. Okay, so let's, any questions, comments about the Abram and Sarah dynamic at this point? Bueller? I always feel the Bueller. That moment of okay.
Could I just say something?
Absolutely.
This is not about the relationship. I just found it interesting as a model that he was Megayer on Hashem and she was Megayer. So early on in the Torah, it's like the man does kirov, but not to the klal, to the men.
Right.
In other
But
words,
the
have the
women-
woman talk to the woman, have the man talk to the man.
Right, and this is where I
There's
go
that
back, like,
separation
it's-
right there.
Right, it's a separation, but it really is, and I know that the phrase separate but equal has come to mean something very negative, but in the Torah view, separate but equal is on its face, it's kipshuto. It's like, these are two people, both of whom are engaged in a partnership in doing Hashem's work, have equal say, equal responsibility, equal role.
I know that. It's just interesting
Yeah.
that it's not the man doing
No, it's
kiruv
not the
to
man,
everybody.
right.
It's like, you know,
Correct.
like an NCSY advisor. You go do the boys.
Right, you do the
It's
boys,
kind of a
you
model.
do the girls, and you know, it's like, you know, when the malachim come, we see the same thing, right? The malachim come to Abraham to tell him of Yitzchak's impending birth, but you know, Abraham, it's only because, again, we see very clearly it's Sarah who goes and prepares the food, but it's part and parcel of the process. It's not like one is more important. It's just one is in the front and one is more behind the scenes. And the other thing that we notice is that, you know, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu here intervenes in the conversation between Avram and Avram and Sarah's reaction to preserve Shalom Bayit. You know, we know very famously of how we learn from Yosef that you can lie to preserve from Shalom Bayit. We don't have to go all the way to Yosef. We can go back to God, right? Because Sarah laughs and she says, you know, what do you mean I'm going to have children? Like, my husband is old and I am not fertile anymore. Well, when Hashem repeats that to Abram, he leaves out the my husband is old piece of it. You know, so Hashem kind of covers it for the wife, which I enjoy. Nice to be covered for sometimes. All right, so let's go forward to the Yitzchak and Rivka relationship, because the Yitzchak and Rivka relationship is totally different than the Avram and Sarah model. So we have to go all the way to Chaye Sarah, which I think is Parakaf Hey, if I'm not mistaken. So first and foremost, the first difference between the Avram and Sarah model as opposed to the Yitzchak and Rivka model is that Avram and Sarah grew up together. They're part of not only a clan, but they're part of a culture, right? They literally grew up in the same town, in the same culture, with the same norms, with
Same
the
family.
same geography, right? And I mean, it's like, it's like they were uncle and niece or whatever they were, but in any case, it's like, when two kids both grow up in Teaneck and, maybe one goes to Marion, one goes to Y&J, but they're both, it's the same Glad Express. It's this, everybody knows what Glad Express is, everybody knows what Route 4 is, everybody knows that when you say the mall, you mean Garden State, There's a same set of cultural norms. It's the same holy name billboard that you see every single day. And it's the same when you talk about the bridge, you know that you're talking about the George Washington Bridge, and you talk about the tunnel, you're talking about the Lincoln Tunnel. Whereas if you are living in Boston and you refer to the tunnel, you're referring to the Big Dig Tunnel under the Storrow Drive. Stay away from it. It's really, really, really. I love Boston. I hate the roads. They really are cow paths. But even when you have a couple where they grow up in two very, very different cultures, like Rivka and Yitzchak did, okay? First of all, geographically, they're living in vastly different types of places. One is growing up in the Judean hills, which are dusty and brown most of the time, and I love them, but they're still dusty and brown most of the time. And one is growing up in Haran, which is part of a fertile plain, like just off of the Mediterranean. One is incredibly rural, the other one is incredibly urban. One's father is fundamentally a nomadic preacher-shepherd, and the other one's father is a businessman. So you're talking right away about, not to mention the fact that Avram and Sarah are 9 years apart, but still, more or less in the same stage of life, as same decade, literally, whereas Rivka and Yitzchak whether you accept the midrash of that she was 3 years old literally, or whether you accept that midrash as a metaphor in the sense that she was little, clearly you're dealing with a little girl, a young girl, as opposed to a man of 40. And we know that the idea of being age 40 is really the apogee of adulthood, and kind of really the end of the first stage of life, and then into the second stage of life, the beginning of middle age, if you wanted, or the beginning of the second third of, if you think about 120 years. So we're talking about two individuals who are coming from geographically very different places, culturally different places, chronologically different places, and then spiritually different places. Like there's a reason, I believe, for all of the midrashim that we have about Lavan and Bethuel as, being conniving, and Bethuel wanting to, one of the ones, right, why is Bethuel mentioned at the beginning and not mentioned later? Because he wanted to poison Eliezer so he could just steal all the wealth, and then he drank the wrong cup of poison, which is why Lavan ends up doing all the business dealings. So I think that, again, this is an archetype. It's that really amoral, if not immoral, businessman versus the supremely moral, almost angelic, pastoral scholar. Right? Talk about opposites. You're dealing with two people who are about as opposite as they come. And we see this, and Yitzchak is, in a way, he is Abraham plus. If you see Yitzchak as being part of this system, right? Yitzchak has grown up in Abraham and Sarah's house, in a house that is dedicated to the work of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is dedicated to outreach, that is pastoral, lots of sheep, lots of goats, whether you believe that there were camels there or not. I don't know if you guys saw that New York Times article a couple of weeks ago, whether there were or were not camels, and anyway. But let's take camels on their face. There were camels, as opposed to Rivka, who grew up in a city with businessmen. And even if businessmen are not conniving and lying and cheating, the mentality of somebody who grows up in the house of two parents, or a father or a mother, who's basically out working on Wall Street, as opposed to a child who grows up with a parent with, parents who are teachers, or father who is rabbi or social worker or psychologist, those sensibilities are going to be very different. It's they're growing up in very, very different systems, and we see that system. Also, Abraham seems to have chosen his wife. Yitzchak had his wife chosen for him, which is also very different. Abraham and Yaakov both saw the women that they were going to marry before they did. Yitzchak is totally going on trust. I think if you have to think about what Yitzchak's main trait is, you'd have to say trust, right? He trusts his father implicitly. Right? What 37-year-old man do you know that will go on a walk with dad up a mountain? We can't, as adults, we can't read that story the same way that first graders read that story. Okay? He knew there's an axe, there are coals, he says, where is that sheep? Like, to me, that's an incredibly intense question. And he was willing to trust his father. He was willing to trust his father's invisible God. He was willing to trust his father's servant. There's a deep, deep trust there. Yitzchak didn't know what it meant to not trust. That's what I think it means when it says that he was blinded, when the angels cried into his eyes. He was so pure, he couldn't conceive of deviousness, of duplicity, and so he goes out into the fields to pray, right? I think we're in Perek Hay at this point. And this is the first time that they meet. And I think it's either the end of Kaf Dalet or the beginning of Kaf Hey. It's like this insanely long parak. Yeah, because Vayihira Av is they're already married. So, and we know the story that Rivka comes riding along on the camel, and Yitzchak is conversing in the field. Whatever that means. The Gemara says that he's davening mincha, and he's davening mincha, or he's meditating, or whatever he's doing. But he's out there communing with nature somehow. And
It's a funny thought.
What?
She said he was on his cell.
He was on his cell. Yeah, probably. Who knows? Except, well, I don't know. There's bad reception out in those fields. He probably had to have 4G at least. Getting really dangerous into the puns here. I'm trying to find the exact language. Okay, we're already here in the beginning of Toldot. I want to get to the point where he looks up, because the language there is really beautiful. Rivka.
Samach Gimel.
What?
Samach Gimel.
Samach Gimel.
Yeah, I got it. Samach Gimel.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Right. He goes out to talk in the field, whatever that means. Right. Lifnot erev, and it's towards evening. It's getting darker. Vayisa einav, and he lifts up his eyes. Vayar, v'hinei gemalim ba'ir. Okay. So let's just take those lines. Okay. So first of all, he lifts up his eyes. Now we don't know if he's lifting up his eyes to heaven because he's davening, or he's lifting up his eyes because he hears something, smells something. We just know, like, Vayisa einav means that there's an awareness of some kind. Vayar, and he sees. And the word vayar, we know, always has a double meaning. It's a physical seeing, but there's also a recognition.
Perceptive.
V'hinei, we know that the word hinei always means that this is surprising. And maybe it's surprising because they're not supposed to be camels in the Middle East, but however you want to, entitle it. And behold, there are camels coming. Okay? At the same moment, it's the same thing. Vatisa Rivka et Eineha Vatere et Yitzchak. And I want to kind of point out that perfect parallel. At the same moment that Yitzchak is seeing, comprehending camels, Rivka is seeing and comprehending Yitzchak. We kind of see this right there, the first meeting, how different these two people are. He sees, he's davening or he's meditating, and he perceives kind of, he's like almost, it's like a split personality. It's like he's here, and then he deals with here. Whereas Rivka sees people, right? And she sees people, and what happens? Vatipol me'al hagamal, and she falls off her camel. I can just imagine shooting this scene, And again, the Midrash here makes a lot of a deal as to why she falls off her camel. But what's clear is that there is some kind of really stark, powerful recognition of a moment of truth. Whether that recognition is, this man is a saint, a tzaddik, this man is my husband, oh my gosh, I'm in love with this man, this is the most, attractive man I've ever seen in my life, this is the rest of my life, whatever it is, it's that sucker gut punch moment of, when you fall off your chair, kind of, that's the metaphor, and she does, and then she's vatomer el ha'ebed, mi ha'ish halazeh, and she says to the servant, she doesn't say mi ha'ish hazeh, she says mi ha'ish halazeh. And lazeh and zeh are different. First of all, lazeh refers to people and not to objects. But second of all, zeh is when you say it's I'm trying to think of how to explain it in English. If she were to say, Mi ha'ish hazeh, who is this man? Basically what it is like, it's like a pointing, like, who's that? Whereas, Mi ha'ish ha'lazeh, which is the same thing that the brothers say when Yosef comes, they say, Hine ba ha'cholem ha'chalom ha'lazeh. It's like this person, this personality. It's not just the body. It's the whole package. So she's recognizing that this is a person, a whole person. And then she says, Ha'holech basadeh likratinu, that he's coming, he's walking in the field, and he's coming, in addition, he's coming to meet us. So she recognizes what he's doing, and again, he's just kind of seen the camels, and she sees him. Vayomer ha'eved, and the servant says, Hu Adoni, he is my master. Vatikach et ha'tza'if vatitkas. Okay, and she immediately takes her veil or her scarf and she covers herself. And again, there are many midrashim that explain this, but again, just on the most basic level, when you cover your face, it's a separation. Like there's a separation being put here. It's whether it's modesty or whether it's whatever it is that immediately we see that these are kind of very different people. And what's remarkable about these very different people we see in their relationship is what happens, right? Now in Pasuk Kaf Zayin, I think it is, right? Vayaviyeha Yitzchak ha'ohala Sarah imo, and he brings her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. Classic systems. Women, wives, inevitably, whether we like it or not, we are the next female in a man's life. Men are the next man in a woman's life. This is we can make fun of it, we can mock it, but it's a reality. In other words, the first female that a man grows up with is his mother. The next closest thing is his wife. So to some degree, the idea men marry their mothers, it's a joke, but it's also a subconscious and biological reality. The same thing goes for women. In other words, our fathers, for women, our fathers are our first males. So the idea that we end up marrying our fathers, again, it's not a joke. It's like we go looking for the thing that is the most familiar to us. So when the Torah tells us that he brings her into Sarah's tent, he's saying, he recognizes that this woman, as different and as foreign and as separate and as other and as young as she is, there's something fundamentally recognizable. And that's, it's that core, call it the neshama, if you want, or their core values that brings them together. And he brings her in, vayikach et Rivka, and again, he takes her, Vatihi lo leisha, going back to the ish and isha, and she was his isha. He was that ezer kenegdo, vaye'ehaveha, and he loved her. There was not only a physical, connection, not only a spiritual connection, but an emotional connection. And this is the first time we hear about love. We don't hear about it with Adam and Chava. We don't hear about it with Abraham and Sarah. But we hear about it with Yitzchak and Rivka. And Vayinachem Yitzchak achar imo, and he is comforted. And we know that the idea of Nechama is something also that's very, very deep. It's not just, I feel better, I'm eating a lollipop. It's that, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. It's that deep, it's almost like it's not just being able to live with the pain, it's like you're able to take the pain and the anguish and the grief and put it in a corner and close the door on it. Not that it disappears, but you're able to really move beyond. That's what Nechama really is. And Yitzchak gets to that point when he marries Rivka. Yes?
When they initially meet, you said she looked at him, he looked at the Gemalim.
Right.
He did not see or perceive or take her in the way she did him.
Correct.
When did he fall in love with her and decide to bring her back to the mother? She
Well-
fell off. She had seen him. She was struck by something about him. When was he struck about something about her?
Once
He hadn't even.
As soon as Eliezer tells the whole story.
Right,
the next
Eliezer
chapter-
tells the whole story,
Yeah.
but it seems that it is through the process of
It's after she fell off?
well, yeah, she falls off, then Eliezer tells Yitzchak what happened, okay? And then after she falls off, after he basically says, this is the woman that your father sent me to marry. By the way, it's only after he marries her that then Eliezer goes and tells Abraham the whole, 2.0 repeat, which is also really interesting, is that there's so much trust and reliance going on, is that it seems that Yitzchak marries her
Miss Beeler, you
before,
have an appointment? Miss Beeler, please call the office.
before Abraham has heard the story.
Yeah, but you know what's also interesting? Usually you want the same thing for your children that you've had. Avram chose his wife.
Right.
Why is it that Avram said, you know what, I chose my wife, but my son's not going to choose his wife?
Right.
Are
You know,
not
I'm
gonna
gonna-
be capable.
Yeah, but
Right.
I don't, even though oftentimes you want the same thing for your child, you're scared that they won't be able to overcome the challenges that you saw. So he may be, I think as a parent, we all do this, that like,
So we want to make all the decisions?
No, not make all the decisions, but I'm saying like, just because,
That'd be nice.
just because as an adult you did
Would it?
something, you
Maybe.
still like
You don't want to
parents
give
can try
them
to
the
shelter their
challenges
kid.
that
Yeah.
you want to
Save them.
Yeah, a
Parents
lot of
do that.
parents do that, like parents who.
Protect them.
Yeah, you're nervous about giving them too many things, like, okay, I came through okay, but I'm not sure the kids are. You see that a lot.
Or he's
Since
kidding.
that's so big now, I think that's so interesting. Like, I was capable, but you know what, I'm going to pick someone for my kid. My
Or
kid's
he
not
could,
gonna have
Esther,
that
he could also say, this is a different kid. Right.
Very
Right.
different.
I
It's
grew
not
up in a
Andy.
different place. This is a different kid.
Very different.
And again, Yitzchak is a really unique,
Yeah, pure.
he's
yeah,
pure,
yeah.
he's almost like a savant, almost like, an Asperger's E.
Yikes.
This is a,
That's been.
not in a negative sense, but in other words, he's like that, I remember
his
reading
strengths.
once like that, how did they pick the next Dalai Lama, right? Like somehow these monks recognize something about some child, that this child is Ra'ui to be the next.
Well, also, he was an
person.
only child. Abraham was in a family with other brothers, He
Right.
has other they're different.
Right. But it is interesting. Like, it is interesting if you look at it in a systemic way, and then in a way Yitzchak sends Yaakov off Dafka to find his own wife, as if to say, maybe this didn't work out. Maybe we'll go back to the way Zadie did it. Right?
But it's also sounding like he based his decision a lot on this incredible, maybe, innocence and trust in his father and his father's judgment, and by association Eliezer, while she looked at
Correct.
Yitzhak and said, "Ooh, this is a guy I want."
Right.
And he was almost like, "They're probably right. If I'm being told she's the one, and I have such a muna in them, that's a different kind of coming to each other."
And we'll see when we start talking next week. I'm gonna have to go in a second. Next week when we move into Yaakov and his wives, and then step back, and I actually want to do parents and children before I do siblings. But we see the same thing when it comes to Esav and Yaakov. In other words, Rivka is very clear-eyed about her children. Yitzchak, whether by choice or not by choice, is not clear-eyed about
Literally.
his children. This whole idea of his vision being dimmed. Certainly his external vision was dimmed. Like, it's also that kind of a personality. There's some people who are so internal that they, for better and for worse, they really don't get what's going on in the real world. And there's a real beauty to that, because, they tend to see the best in people and they don't become cynical. Yitzchak never becomes cynical. It's Rivka's cynicism that, she's the one. She's katzti b'chayai mibnei chet, right? When Esav marries these women, she's like, that. And he's like, it's okay, don't worry about it. He's much more relaxed in that sense. And there's a beauty and an innocence and a purity.
But you know something? You made a big thing about his. The most important thing was trust.
Mhm.
This was like the center of his, and he's Dafka, the one that's, that's tricked, and suffers tremendous deceit. And how shocking, all the more so it must have been.
Right.
It's his wife. it's his children, it's his world that deceives him.
Right, and yet.
Not for him.
And this is the, hang on one thing, this is the one thing I actually wanted to end with, is that it is his world, and his wife, of all people, is the one to deceive him, and he doesn't reproach her.
Also, I think it's so important to keep in mind that there's divine influence and intervention at every juncture that we just studied. Hashem saves Sarah in Mitzrayim. He saves her in Plishtim. Hashem makes something miraculous happen with Eliezer. He didn't just bring
Right.
a random woman home. We have to hear about it for about 200 psukim. When he makes the plan, it happens, he tells it over.
Tells over the
This is
plan.
not- This is not just,
Random.
Right, it's not.
I'm trying to find a shidduch and I hope it's gonna
Right,
work out.
right.
You know, it wasn't like that.
Right, although
So-
Yaakov was deceived too, I just.
Right, so we're gonna talk about Yaakov next week, but I
that-
just think
even
it's.
that deceit feels like Hashem is not in some other place.
Right.
It's all too coincidental to
Right.
be not the way it's supposed
Right,
to be.
But the fact that he doesn't reproach her, to me,
Yeah.
is such a testament to how much he trusts his wife.
Right.
You know, so,
But
anyway.
he's kind of angry at Yaakov.